The first day at a new school is always a strange kind of quiet chaos. For Leo, it felt like he was walking through a movie where everyone else had the script but him. Northwood High was a sprawling maze of red brick and loud, echoing hallways, a world away from the small, single-building high school he'd left behind. He clutched the strap of his backpack with one hand, his knuckles white, while his other hand guided his most precious and most awkward possession, a large black cello case. It was almost as tall as he was, and it made him navigate the crowded hallways like a ship in a tight canal, drawing stares he could feel without even seeing. He was the new kid, and the giant black appendage made him feel like an alien who had just landed. Everywhere he looked, there were groups. Clusters of girls laughing by lockers, guys in Letterman jackets high-fiving, students with art portfolios tucked under their arms huddled in corners. They all seemed to move with an unspoken rhythm, a social choreography he couldn't begin to understand. He was a soloist in a world that seemed to only value ensembles. So he did what he always did when he felt out of place. He looked for a quiet corner, a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. He found it at the end of a forgotten hallway on the second floor. The door was slightly ajar, and a small faded sign read, "Music Room." Pushing the door open, he was hit by a smell that was instantly comforting. It was a mix of old wood, rosin, and the faint, dusty scent of sheet music that had been sitting for years. Sunlight streamed through a large window, illuminating dancing dust motes like tiny, glittering spirits. The room was empty, filled with stands, chairs, and a variety of instruments in various states of rest. It was perfect. With a sigh of relief that seemed to deflate his entire body, Leo carefully leaned his cello case against the wall. It wasn't just an instrument. It was his oldest friend. It was the one thing that had been constant through every move. Every new town, every wave of loneliness. He carefully unlocked the case and lifted the cello out. The polished wood felt warm and familiar under his fingertips. He sat on a straight-backed chair, settling the instrument between his knees, its body resting against his own. He felt the vibration of it even before he played, a silent promise of the music to come. He took his bow, tightened the horsehair just right, and rosined it slowly, methodically. It was a ritual, a meditation that calmed his racing heart. Then he closed his eyes and let the bow find the strings. The first note was a deep, resonant C, a sound so full and rich it seemed to fill every corner of the silent room. It was a sound that was completely his. In that moment, the crowded hallways, the staring eyes, the feeling of being an outsider, it all melted away. There was only him, the wood, the strings, and the music. He played a simple, melancholic melody he had composed himself, a song that spoke of quiet rooms and long roads. The notes hung in the air, heavy with emotion. He wasn't just playing notes. He was telling his story, the one he couldn't say out loud. The cello's voice was his voice, and it was strong and clear. Even when he felt small and lost, it was during these after-school sessions that he first became aware of the other musical force at Northwood High. He would be lost in a batch suite. And suddenly, a distant sound would bleed through the walls. It was the sharp, electric crack of a distorted guitar, followed by a heavy, driving beat of drums. It was the sound of a different world. A loud, confident, aggressive world. It was the sound of Vanishing Point. He heard the name before he ever saw the faces. Whispers in the cafeteria, excited chatter before classes, posters plastered on every available surface. Vanishing Point was the school's band, and they were local legends. Their posters featured moody, black and white photos of three guys, their faces partially obscured by shadows and hair. The one in the center was always the most prominent. He had a shock of dark, artfully messy hair, a jawline that could cut glass, and eyes that stared right through the camera lens with an unnerving confidence. This was their world, and Leo was just a visitor. One afternoon, he was packing up his cello after a long practice session. As he stepped into the hallway, he saw them. They were walking towards him, a small, gravitational field of coolness. The guy from the posters was in the middle, flanked by a drummer with a lopsided grin and a bassist who looked permanently bored. They were laughing about something, their voices echoing in the empty hall. This was Mark, Leo instinctively pressed himself against the wall, trying to make himself and his cello case as small as possible. He didn't want to be noticed, but as they got closer, Mark's eyes, the same intense eyes from the posters, flicked in his direction. They didn't linger, but it was enough. Leo felt a jolt, like he'd been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to. Mark didn't say anything. He just smirked, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips, and then looked away, continuing his conversation as if Leo were just another part of the wall. But that smirk was powerful. It was a look that said, "I see you. I know you don't belong here. And this is my world." Leo stood there for a long moment after they passed, his heart thumping in his chest. He watched them disappear around the corner, their laughter fading. He looked down at his cello case, its smooth black surface, a stark contrast to the raw energy Mark and his band seemed to radiate. In that moment, the gap between their two worlds felt like a chasm. His was a world of quiet notes, of solitary practice, of finding beauty in silence. Theirs was a world of power chords, of cheering crowds, of demanding attention with every loud, defiant sound. He was a solitary cellist, and Mark was the king of rock and roll. And in the hierarchy of Northwood High, there was no question who was on top. Leo picked up his cello, the weight feeling heavier than before, and started the long walk home. The school week trudged on, a blur of new faces and unfamiliar classrooms. Leo found a routine, a small path he could follow without drawing too much attention. He'd eat his lunch in the corner of the cafeteria, head to the library to study, and finish his day in the quiet sanctuary of the music room. The cello was his anchor, the one constant in a sea of change. The distant thunder of Vanishing Point practicing in the main auditorium had become just another part of the background noise, a reminder of the world that existed just outside his quiet bubble. Then, one Tuesday morning, he saw it, tacked onto a crowded bulletin board near the main office. Amidst flyers for a bake sale and a lost cat was a bright yellow poster. The letters were bold and black, screaming for attention. "Northwood Showcase. Your time to shine." Below it, details were listed about the annual Battle of the Bands style event, the biggest musical night of the school year. His eyes scanned the page and his heart sank a little. Taped right below the main announcement was a smaller, professionally printed poster for Vanishing Point, announcing they would be the headlining act. A photo of the three of them, looking moody and cool, stared back at him. Mark was in the center, his expression confident, almost challenging. Leo sighed and was about to walk away when a voice spoke beside him. "You play, right? I've seen you with that big case." Leo turned to see a girl from his history class. She had a friendly face and a streak of bright pink in her dark hair. He didn't know her name, but she'd always smiled at him when their paths crossed. "Oh, yeah," Leo mumbled, feeling a familiar blush creep up his neck. "The cello. You should totally sign up," she said, her voice bright and genuine. "The showcase is awesome. It's not just for rock bands. Last year, a girl did a whole folk set. It was amazing." She pointed to a clipboard hanging from a hook next to the posters. "The sign-up sheet is right there. You should do it." Leo's first instinct was a firm, internal no. It was a terrible idea. The stage was the last place he wanted to be, a spotlight for his awkwardness. He imagined himself up there, with his cello, trying to compete with the wall of sound from a band like Vanishing Point. The thought was almost laughable. He'd be a joke. But the girl was looking at him with such encouraging eyes, and for a split second, a tiny, reckless part of him wondered, what if? What if he could just play his music, not to compete, but just to be heard? I don't know," he said weakly. "Come on," she nudged playfully. "What's the worst that could happen?" He could think of about 100 worse things, but he just gave a small, non-committal shrug. She smiled again and walked off, leaving him standing there, staring at the clipboard. It felt like it was calling to him. The rest of the day, the idea festered in the back of his mind. During math class, he found himself doodling a shallow on his notebook instead of solving equations. At lunch, he watched groups of students talking excitedly about the showcase, their faces lit with the same ambition he saw on Mark's poster. That tiny, reckless spark inside him grew a little brighter, finally. As the final bell rang, he found his feet carrying him back to the bulletin board. The hallway was empty now, filled with the echoes of departing students. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He took a deep breath, grabbed the pen chained to the clipboard, and flipped to the sign-up sheet. There, at the top, written in a thick, aggressive scrawl of black Sharpie, was one word, Mark. Under it, in smaller letters, Vanishing Point Rock. The handwriting itself seemed to radiate confidence. Leo's hand trembled slightly as he clicked the pen. He found an empty spot a few lines down and in his neat, small handwriting that looked like it was afraid to take up too much space. He wrote, Leo, cello. The moment he finished, a wave of panic washed over him. What had he done? He quickly capped the pen and practically ran from the hallway, his backpack thumping against his back. He spent the whole walk home convincing himself he would just tell the organizers he'd made a mistake. He would back out. It was the sensible thing to do, but the next day, as he was navigating the crowded cafeteria during lunch, he felt a shift in the room's energy. It was like a ripple moving through water. The general chatter seemed to quiet and heads began to turn. Leo didn't have to look to know who had entered. He could feel the presence of Mark and his bandmates as they moved through the space, a vortex of effortless cool. Leo shrank in his seat, hoping to be invisible, focusing intensely on the pathetic-looking pile of mashed potatoes on his tray. He heard a voice. Not Mark's, but one of his friends. Dude, check it out. Leo risked a glance. They were standing by the bulletin board, looking at the sign-up sheet. He saw the friend point, a smirk on his face. Mark leaned in, his expression unreadable at first. Then Leo saw it. The corner of Mark's mouth twitched. The smirk was born. It was the same smirk he had given Leo in the hallway, but this time it was bigger, more performative. Mark said something to his friends, and they all laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was sharp and mocking, and then they started moving. Not towards the exit, but directly towards Leo's table. Every single instinct in Leo's body screamed at him to run, but his feet were frozen to the floor. The cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on him. He could feel 100 pairs of boring into his skin. Mark stopped right beside his table, casting a shadow over Leo's tray. He didn't sit down. He just loomed. A cello, Leo? Mark said, his voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. He said Leo's name like it was a foreign word he was trying out for the first time. He looked down at Leo, his eyes filled with a lazy, condescending amusement. At the showcase? He let out a short, humorless laugh. Listen, save everyone the trouble. This isn't an orchestra recital for your grandparents. Leo's face was on fire. He could feel the heat in his cheeks, his ears. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the plastic chair. He couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly. He just stared at his plate, wishing he could become one of the mashed potatoes. Mark leaned down closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more intimidating than his shout. I'll make you a deal. The smell of his cologne, something sharp and chemical, filled Leo's senses. If you can actually get on that stage and play something that isn't a total joke, I'll personally apologize to you in front of the whole school. He straightened up, a look of triumphant smugness on his face. He reached out and gave Leo a pat on the shoulder. It wasn't a friendly pat. It was heavy, a gesture of ownership and dismissal. Think about it, kid. Then he turned and walked away, his friends falling into step behind him. Their laughter echoed through the cafeteria, bouncing off the walls and following Leo long after they were gone. The silence that fell over the room in their wake was just as loud. Leo sat there, frozen, the food on his tray turning to stone in his stomach. The humiliation was a physical weight crushing him. He had been challenged, mocked, and put on display in front of the entire school. And in that moment, the tiny, reckless spark inside him wasn't just a spark anymore. It was a fuse, and Mark had just lit it. The walk home that day was the longest of Leo's life. Each step felt heavy, as if he was walking through wet cement. The faces of the other students on the sidewalk, the cars driving by, the birds chirping in the trees, it all seemed like a blurry, distant movie. The only thing that was sharp and clear was the scene in the cafeteria, playing on a loop inside his head. He saw Mark smirk, heard his voice dripping with condescension, felt the heavy, dismissive pat on his shoulder. The word joke echoed in the empty chambers of his mind. He kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the cracks in the pavement, wishing he could just sink into one of them and disappear when he finally got to his house. He didn't even say hello to his mom, who was in the kitchen. He just mumbled something about having a lot of homework and trudged up to his room, closing the door behind him. He threw his backpack onto the floor, where it landed with a dull thud. For a long time, he just stood in the middle of his room, his body buzzing with a mixture of shame and anger. He looked over at his cello, standing proudly in its stand in the corner. For the first time ever, he felt a flicker of resentment towards it. It was because of the cello, because of his quiet, different world, that this had happened. Mark and his friends would never have noticed him if he just played a normal instrument. Like a guitar or drums, he flopped onto his bed, burying his face in his pillow. The sensible, logical part of his brain was screaming at him. Just quit. Call the school office tomorrow morning, tell them you're sick, tell them anything. Back out of the showcase? It was the only way to make it all stop. The humiliation would fade, eventually. People would find something else to talk about. He could go back to being invisible, which was 1,000 times better than being a public joke. He almost convinced himself. He could feel the relief of just giving up, of letting the challenge die, but then another feeling started to bubble up from deep inside him. It was small at first, but it was persistent. It was the feeling of the bow in his hand, the vibration of the strings against his chest, the way a perfect note could hang in the air and make everything feel right. He thought about the music room, his sanctuary. He thought about the melodies he created, the stories he told without words. Mark didn't know any of that. To him, the cello was just a prop, a symbol of something old and boring. He had dismissed not just Leo, but the music itself. Slowly, Leo sat up. He looked at the cello again. The resentment was gone, replaced by a strange new feeling. It was a protective instinct. He wasn't going to let Mark win. He wasn't going to let him turn his oldest friend, his voice, into a punchline. A hard little knot of resolve formed deep in his stomach. He wasn't doing this for the school, or for Mark, or to prove anything to anyone else. He was doing it for himself. He was doing it for the music. He stood up and walked over to the cello. He ran a hand along its smooth, curved back. He didn't sit down. He just stood there for a moment, then picked up his bow. He didn't play one of his usual quiet, sad songs. That felt like surrender. Instead, he just started sawing at the strings, letting out all his frustration and anger in a series of raw, jagged notes. It wasn't music. It was a scream. But as he played, something began to change. The chaos started to find a rhythm. The anger started to focus. He wasn't just screaming anymore. He was building something. That night he didn't do his homework. He went online, searching through digital libraries of modern cello music. He was looking for a weapon. He found it in a piece by a composer he'd only read about, a work known for its technical difficulty and its raw, explosive emotion. It blended classical structure with percussive, almost aggressive techniques. It was a piece that didn't ask for attention. It demanded it. It was the musical equivalent of a roar. It was perfect. And it was way, way beyond anything he had ever attempted before. The next few weeks became a blur of intense, solitary focus. Leo's world shrank until it contained only 3 things: his room, his cello, and the sheet music for that one impossible piece. He practiced until his fingers were raw and the tips of his left hand were covered in new, tough calluses. He practiced until his shoulder ached and his back was sore. He would get home from school and play until dinner, eat in 5 minutes, and then play until his mom knocked on his door, telling him it was past midnight. There were moments of crushing frustration. A particular fast passage, a series of complex chords, would trip him up over and over again. He would let out a groan of anger, slamming the bow down on his music stand. But he never quit. He would take a deep breath, close his eyes, and start again, Slowly, painfully, he would break the impossible section into tiny, manageable pieces and practice each one until his fingers remembered the pattern, until the movements became muscle memory. He was no longer just playing the notes. He was carving them into his soul. Meanwhile, at school, the story of the cello challenge had taken on a life of its own. It had become a piece of local folklore, a funny sideshow to the main event of Vanishing Point's performance. Leo would overhear snippets of conversation as he walked through the hallways. "Did you hear about the cello kid?" Mark totally called him out. "I heard he's actually going to do it. It's going to be a train wreck." I can't wait to see the look on Mark's face. This is going to be hilarious. Each time he heard these whispers, he felt a fresh sting of humiliation. But now it was different. It wasn't a paralyzing shame. It was fuel. It was more wood for the fire he was building inside himself. He would walk to his next class, his hands shoved in his pockets, his head down, but his mind would be racing, thinking about that difficult passage, visualizing his fingers flying across the strings. He was no longer the victim of their joke. He was the secret keeper of a storm that was about to break. He saw Mark in the halls a few times. Mark would be holding court with his friends, laughing, looking completely unbothered. Once, their eyes met across the crowded hallway. Mark didn't smirk this time. He just gave a small, almost bored shrug, as if to say, "I've already forgotten about you." But Leo saw the flicker of arrogance in his eyes, the absolute certainty of his own victory. And in that moment, Leo felt no fear. He felt nothing but a calm, clear sense of purpose. He just nodded once, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, and continued on his way. He had a secret weapon, and he was getting stronger with every single note. The night of the Northwood Showcase arrived with a buzz that seemed to make the very air of the school vibrate. The auditorium, usually a place of dusty assemblies and boring assemblies, was transformed. The old velvet seats were filled with students, parents, and teachers, all chattering in a low, excited hum. The air smelled of floor wax, anticipation, and the faint electric scent of stage lights. Backstage, it was a different world. It was a maze of chords, cases, and nervous energy. Musicians tuned their instruments, paced in small circles, and wiped sweaty palms on their jeans. Leo found a small corner behind a heavy black curtain, his cello case standing guard beside him like a silent sentinel. He felt a strange sense of calm. The weeks of relentless practice had burned away the nervousness, leaving behind a core of pure, quiet focus. He had done the work. There was nothing left to do now but play. From his hiding spot, he could hear the crowd roar as the lights went down. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, introducing the headlining act. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. Give it up for Northwood's own Vanishing Point. The crowd erupted. Leo felt the floor shake with the force of their applause. He peeked through a small gap in the curtain. The stage was bathed in blue and purple light. Mark and his band walked on to a hero's welcome. Mark moved with an easy grace, a small smile playing on his lips as he slung his electric guitar over his shoulder. He was in his kingdom. What followed was a masterclass in performance. Vanishing Point was tight, polished, and undeniably good. Mark was a natural frontman, his voice clear and strong, his guitar solos fast and fluid. He commanded the stage, working the crowd with practiced ease. They played their original songs, a mix of driving rock anthems and brooding power ballads, and the audience loved every second of it. They sang along to the words, cheered for the guitar solos, and raised their phones in the air, creating a sea of tiny lights. Leo watched from the wings, not with envy, but with a musician's appreciation. He could see the skill, the hours of practice it took to make it look that effortless. He could see the structure of their songs, the way they built and released tension. They were good. But as he watched, he also saw something else. He saw the performance. The practice smirks, the rehearsed moves, the cool detachment. It was a perfect shiny surface. But Leo knew his own music wasn't like that. His was raw, messy, and full of cracks. It was real. They finished their set with a thunderous final chord that hung in the air long after the song ended. The crowd was on its feet, screaming for more. Mark took a deep bow, a look of pure triumph on his face. He scanned the adoring crowd, his eyes lingering for a moment on the front row where his friends were cheering wildly. He had forgotten all about the cello kid. In his mind, the night was his. He had already won dot as the applause finally died down and the stage lights dimmed for the changeover. A different energy settled over the room. It was the sound of 1,000 whispered conversations. The announcer's voice cut through the buzz. "Thank you, Vanishing Point. What a show. And now we have one more performer for you all tonight. Please welcome to the stage, Leo." A ripple of snickers and confused murmurs spread through the auditorium. Leo took a deep breath, picked up his cello, and walked out onto the stage. The single spotlight hit him, blinding him for a second. He felt incredibly small and alone on the vast, empty stage. He saw the sea of faces, most of them looking bored or amused. He walked to the center of the stage and sat on the simple wooden stool that had been left for him. He settled the cello between his knees, its familiar weight a comforting presence. He closed his eyes, blocking out the world, and took one last, steadying breath. Then he began to play. The first notes were not what anyone expected. They were quiet, almost hesitant. A long, haunting melody that seemed to pull the sound out of the very air. It was a sound so pure and full of sorrow that a hush fell over the entire auditorium. The whispers died. The fidgeting stopped. Everyone leaned in, drawn in by the sheer beauty of the sound. For a moment, Leo was just a boy playing a sad song on a big instrument. But then, everything changed. The music exploded. It was a sudden, violent shift that made several people in the audience jump. Leo's bow was no longer just drawing out melodies. It was attacking the strings. He was using the wood of his bow to beat a percussive, frantic rhythm on the body of the cello, creating a sound like a frantic heartbeat. He was plucking the strings so hard they slapped against the fingerboard. He was digging deep into the notes, creating a raw, guttural growl that no one knew a cello could make. The quiet melody was gone, replaced by a fury of sound. It was aggressive, passionate, and chaotic, yet underneath it all, there was a powerful, driving structure. It was a fight set to music. In the front row, Mark's smirk had vanished the moment the first quiet notes began. He had settled back in his seat, ready to be amused for a minute before he and his friends left. But as the music grew, he found himself leaning forward, his expression slowly changing from boredom to confusion and then to utter shock. As a musician, he was one of the only people in the room who could truly comprehend what he was seeing. He saw the impossible speed of Leo's fingers, the complex, unconventional techniques, the sheer physical power it took to produce those sounds. He saw not just a kid playing an instrument, but an artist channeling a storm. The cool, polished performance he and his band had just delivered suddenly felt hollow, artificial. This was real. This was dangerous. This was music that was alive. The rest of the audience was just as captivated. They weren't just watching a performance anymore. They were experiencing something. They were witnessing a transformation. The quiet, awkward new kid was gone. In his place was this powerful figure, his eyes closed, his body swaying and moving with the music, completely lost in its storm. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for himself, and they were just lucky enough to be there to hear it. The music told a story of anger, of defiance, of pain, and of a strength that was forged in solitude. It was the story of the last few weeks, told without a single word. The piece reached its climax. A dizzying flurry of notes that seemed to hang on the edge of chaos before finally resolving into one long, powerful, and heartbreaking chord. Leo held it, his whole body trembling with the effort, the sound filling every corner of the silent hall. Then he let his bow fall away. The final note vibrated into silence. For a full 5 seconds, there was absolute, stunned silence in the auditorium. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if everyone was still under the spell of the music. Then, a single person in the back started clapping. It was quickly joined by another, and another, until the quiet was shattered by a tidal wave of sound. The applause was deafening, a roar of approval that was more genuine and powerful than the one Vanishing Point had received. It grew into a standing ovation, the entire room rising to its feet as one. Leo opened his eyes. blinking in the bright light as if waking from a dream. He was breathing heavily, his shirt soaked with sweat, his fingers throbbing. He saw the hundreds of people on their feet cheering for him. A wave of shock and relief washed over him. He gave a shaky bow, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had done it. He had played his music, and they had listened. The sound was a physical thing, a wave of pressure that washed over Leo, leaving him breathless. For a moment, the world was just a blur of bright lights and a roaring wall of noise. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum solo that seemed to match the rhythm of the applause. He could feel the sweat trickling down his temples, his shirt clinging to his back. His fingers, raw and throbbing from the performance, felt numb. He blinked, his eyes slowly adjusting to the glare of the single spotlight. The sea of faces came into focus, but they weren't the bored, amused faces he had seen when he walked on stage. They were alive, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. Every single person was on their feet, their hands clapping in a unified, thunderous rhythm. It was a sound of pure, unfiltered appreciation. He had never experienced anything like it. He was used to quiet, polite applause at small recitals, the kind of sound that was more about obligation than emotion. This was different. This was raw. This was real. A shaky, unfamiliar feeling bubbled up in his chest. It was joy. He gave a small, awkward bow, the motion feeling foreign and clumsy. The roar of the crowd only grew louder. He felt a smile tug at his lips, a real, genuine smile that he couldn't have stopped if he tried. He quickly turned and walked off the stage, his legs feeling like they might give out from under him at any second. The moment he stepped into the wings, the world changed again. The deafening applause was muffled by the heavy black curtains, replaced by the quieter, more chaotic energy of backstage. A roadie he didn't know gave him a firm pat on the shoulder and a nod of respect. "That was something else, kid," he said, his voice gruff but kind. Leo just nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He found his small corner behind the curtain and leaned against the wall, his cello still in his hand. He closed his eyes, letting the adrenaline slowly ebb away, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. He wasn't alone for long. A small crowd started to gather around him, other musicians from the showcase. A girl with a trumpet looked at him with wide eyes. "How did you do that?" She breathed. "I've never heard anyone play a cello like that." The guy from the folk trio that had played earlier clapped him on the back. "Man, you stole the whole show, seriously." Then he saw the girl from his history class, the one with the pink streak in her hair. She pushed through the small crowd and gave him a huge hug. "I knew you could do it." She squealed, her voice full of excitement. "Leo, that was the most amazing thing I have ever heard. Everyone's talking about it." Leo just stood there, taking it all in. These were people he had never spoken to, people who inhabited the same school but a different social universe. Now they were looking at him not with pity or amusement, but with genuine respect. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the stage lights. He was part of something. He was seeing Dot as the crowd around him started to disperse. He felt a different kind of presence. It was a shift in the air, a sudden quiet that fell over the small space. He looked up and saw him. Mark was standing a few feet away, his bandmates lingering in the background. The cocky swagger was gone. The easy, confident smile had vanished. He looked smaller somehow, less like a king and more like just another guy. He was holding his electric guitar by its neck, but he wasn't posing with it. It just hung there, heavy and inert. For a moment they just looked at each other. The noise from the auditorium, where the next act was being introduced, seemed to fade into the background. Leo felt a flicker of his old fear, a memory of the humiliation in the cafeteria. But it was just a flicker. He held his ground, his grip tightening slightly on the neck of his cello. He was not the same person who had been challenged a few weeks ago. Mark took a step forward. He didn't look at Leo's cello or at his shoes. He looked him right in the eye. And in his eyes, Leo saw not arrogance, but a look of humble, sincere respect. "I was an idiot," Mark said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it was clear and steady. There was no hint of a smirk, no trace of his old condescending tone. It was just a simple, honest statement of fact. Leo didn't know what to say. He just stood there, listening. Mark continued, his gaze unwavering. That was... You're a real musician, man, truly. He paused, as if searching for the right words. What I do? What we do? It's a show. It's loud and it's fun. But what you did up there... That was art? I'm sorry. For everything I said? He didn't offer the loud, public apology he had promised in the cafeteria. He didn't make a spectacle of it. This wasn't for the crowd. This was just for Leo, and in that moment it meant more than any grand gesture ever could. It was a moment of honest connection between two artists, one who had learned a lesson and one who had found his voice. Mark then did something that surprised Leo even more. He shifted his guitar to his other hand and extended his right hand. It was a simple gesture, an offer of peace, of respect. Leo looked at the outstretched hand for a second. Then he carefully leaned his cello against the wall and reached out. Their hands met in a firm, solid handshake. It wasn't a competition. It was an understanding. Good luck with your band, Leo said, his own voice sounding stronger than he expected. Mark gave a small, sad smile. Yeah, you too, man. You're going to do great things. Then he turned and walked away, his bandmates following him without a word. Leo watched them go, a strange feeling of finality settling over him. The challenge was over. The rivalry was gone. He turned back to his cello, his oldest and most loyal friend. He carefully wiped the rosin dust from the strings, his movements slow and deliberate. He loosened the bow and packed it away in its case. He settled the instrument into its velvet-lined bed, his hands moving with a familiar, practiced grace. As he closed the latches on the case, the sound was soft and final. He was no longer the quiet new kid who hid in the music room. He was Leo, the cellist. And as he shouldered the case and walked out of the auditorium and into the cool night air, he felt a lightness he had never felt before. The world was full of music, and for the first time, he was ready to make his own sound.